From a professional soccer career to becoming a driving force in the mortgage industry, Brian Covey has shown what it takes to find your competitive edge. Get off the sidelines and get in the game. Find your competitive edge with Brian Covey.
What's happening, guys, and welcome back to another edition of Finding Your Competitive Edge. So today's guest not only has found their competitive edge, but I think it's going to be unique for you to listen. How do they discover their competitive edge? And it's usually through going through a storm. It's battling some type of adversity. And for many of us, it's fear. The big four-letter word right there that we don't talk about, but is real for us. And our guest today, Adam Hill, not only is he an international sought-out speaker, he's got a podcast like this that we're doing today that I think you guys should tune into, Flow Over Fear. And he's got a best-selling book, Shifting Gears. And he's an Ironman. So I am fascinated by that because that is something I've seen people do it, even in my own journey, doing a lot of cool things in sports. To accomplish that, you have to have discipline and commitment. You had to overcome some fears. So today we're going to dive into that, leadership, being an entrepreneur, and a lot more. So you're going to want to take out a pen and paper because what Adam has been able to do, and what more importantly, he's learned through what he's done, is going to inspire you, motivate you, but give you the tools to do this in your own life. So Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, man. This is exciting to be here.
Well, fellow podcast host, which is always fun. I will tell you, they always make for the best guests because they're prepared. They know their stories. And I always find too, people that are listening in, the feedback we get is, man, they were able to convey that in a way that spoke to me, like where I'm at today. And so I'm excited for that today. And dude, I got to jump into this because as I'm prepping, I always love learning about people's stories. And we were talking about Denver and some of the stuff and where you are today. But really, I want to go back to, you talk about this pretty openly, of overcoming some of the alcohol and some unhealthy habits. And I find this time of the season, right, that people are dealing with some of that right now. They're around family events, maybe business events and all that, and they're uncomfortable. So they grab a drink or they grab a vice that's going to help them through that. And tell us a little about that story of where you were, because I think a lot of times that's how we learn more about who we are and people be able to relate to that story.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to mention the whole December drinking fest kind of thing, because that was always a theme for me. Was like, January 1st, that was the day I was going to stop drinking all the time, because of course it's New Year's resolution, all of that. But in December it was on all of the parties, all of that kind of stuff. So I can definitely relate to a lot of people who might be struggling with that with that whole thing right now. And drinking really started for me as a coping mechanism, as a solution to my anxiety. I grew up in my early childhood. I didn't have a bad childhood, and like two parents that loved each other, and great school, didn't really have any problems, but I just had this underlying worry that was constantly with me. And most of the decisions that I made in my life were based out of a desire to avoid fear or avoid kind of risky situations or anything like that. And so I lived with that for most of my childhood through high school and all of that. But then in college, as many people do, I discovered alcohol, and it happened at a party. I drank my first beer out of a keg of Mickey's Lager, if you can remember. Mickey's Lager. Yeah. And it tasted terrible, as you can imagine, but the feeling immediately hit, and it was like the world opened up to me at that moment. Like the world just said, oh wait, I don't have that fear anymore. That just got lifted from me. And now I'm kind of the life of the party, and I'm having a great time and meeting girls and all of this kind of stuff, all this stuff that I never did before. So it was all of this reward and not a lot of consequence at first, because I woke up, I went home after 3 beers, woke up without a hangover, and all was good and all was right with the world. And so there was no real indication that I would be a problem drinker at that time. And I didn't really know. And when I thought of alcoholism to me was this idea of a person sleeping behind a dumpster, or, people with terrible childhoods, things that didn't relate to me. Yeah. So it just never entered my mind. And over time, of course, this insidious disease and pull just started coming to me, which was I gradually lost control over the next decade, to the points where I started blacking out more often, and the panic attacks got worse. And so while the anxiety was getting worse, so too was my drinking. And ultimately it just developed into this vicious cycle where I was drinking to numb the pain by night, to numb the anxiety, and then trying to white knuckle it through most days through this despair and panic that was just constantly there. And that was my life for about 10 years.
Wow. I think a lot of people can relate to that too, right? I mean, I know through high school and college, like to get in the in crowd and to fit into those things, and you're uncomfortable already around some of that. And you're like, man, well, everybody's drinking. And I think it's started to shift a little bit. I'd love your take on this, but I know when I was coming through college, it was definitely, you were an outsider. You were the minority. If you didn't drink, it's like, man, what's wrong with that person? It wasn't really something that people would admire or even go, oh, that's cool. Hey, you don't drink. Now, as we've gotten older, obviously, I think that's changed. Do you think that's become more today, where I've noticed people lately, man, they're taking off from drinking and they've stopped drinking, and you've got more people standing up saying, I just don't need that. I'm not my best when I do that. So are you seeing that shift as well? Is that an age thing, you think, or how is that playing out from your perspective?
Yeah, I'm seeing it a lot too. And to be honest, I can't really describe, I can't figure out where it's coming from, but I love that it is coming about, because I'm seeing it a lot more often in 30 to 40 and, between 40 and 50-year-olds that especially among the crowds of at least the people that I surround myself with, which tend to be other entrepreneurs, business leaders, and things like that. And they're just saying, it just doesn't serve me anymore. And that's the thing I hear the most often. It doesn't serve me. And that's pretty profound, especially in a world where we are consumed by so much more anxiety, so much more stimulus, that people are opting out of the alcohol flywheel that we've been in. So I see that, and I think it's powerful, but it's also not to minimize that. I think a lot of people are still struggling with that, and there may be an underlying idea of people that want to stop, but they just don't know how, or they just can't, or they feel like it's not possible for them. And I hope that people, by hearing at least what I've gone through, that they can realize that there's hope beyond that hopelessness. As I've been in that state where I just never thought that I could ever stop drinking. It just never seemed possible for me. But when I look back now from where I'm at, a sober person with 12 years sober, who is, living life to its fullest and still, having the daily anxieties that I've always had, but living more fully now, more present. I want to show people that there is that life, that miracle beyond the hopelessness that they're feeling now.
Hey guys, it's Brian here. I hope you are enjoying the show. By the way, if you're an entrepreneur or a solopreneur looking to grow your personal brand, make a bigger impact, maybe increase your leads and grow your revenue, let's help you get started today by connecting up with my friends over at the Brand Builders Group. You've heard me talk about them, but if you're new here, this is definitely the first step to get you started in turning your reputation into revenue. Head over to freebrandcall.com/Brian Covey. Again, to set up your free brand call, go to freebrandcall.com/Brian Covey to set up a free strategy call with one of the team at Brand Builders, and they will dive into your specific goals for how you want to grow your personal brand. I can't wait to hear how it goes. I love it. That's why I was so excited to have you on, because I think a lot of people are battling that today. And I know with 3 kids, it's like trying to teach them of, hey, I know you don't want to hear your dad tell you this, but it's not worth all that, and guide them through. And some friends, I love what you said too, because I started thinking about this was, really for entrepreneurs, who you surround yourself with, it may be that you need to change up that circle around you. And I found that is much more normal around my friends that work out, my friends that are actually more successful, to be honest.
Yeah.
They're not the ones out there partying and drinking and doing all that stuff. And they really, to your point, they always say, that's just not serving me in this season of my life. And it's just doesn't make me better.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, I want to be around those people. So
yeah, for sure.
Man, let's shift gears, because you've got obviously that story there, which is a huge anchor. I think you learned from that. But I started to look at this too, in your story of, then you go from that and you train for 4 years and you make the Kona Ironman and all this. So one, I want to know, like, what prompted you? Because I always find there's cool stories behind, like, someone just doesn't wake up one day and go, I'm going to go do an Ironman. Like, where did that come from for you? And what was really the genesis of why you wanted to do that?
Yeah. So the seed was planted much earlier than when I decided to do it. It was planted, when I was in the midst of my anxiety, alcoholism, and all of that. I remember that I was watching television on a Saturday afternoon, and the Ironman broadcast came on, the broadcast of the annual Ironman World Championship. And I didn't know what it was at the time, but I saw all of these athletes and I just assumed that they were Australian because they were wearing Speedos and, doing crazy things that Australians do. But I love you Australians, by the way. Don't. Yeah. but they were just doing this amazing thing that I just couldn't comprehend. They were swimming 2.4 miles, biking 112 miles, running a full marathon all in one day. And the amazing thing was that when they got to the finish line, they were smiling. I mean, some of them finishing 17 hours later. And the very last place finisher in this race, I mean, usually the last place finisher is going to be the most miserable, upset person in the world in any other sport. But this person was the happiest person on the planet for finishing last place in an Ironman triathlon. And there was something that just inspired me incredibly about that. And not to mention the stories of the people who are finishing, like Rick and Dick Hoyt, the father and son team, father pushing his son with cerebral palsy, the Iron Nun, the 80-year-old nun who was competing in an Ironman, all these great stories. And it just inspired me to think for that one moment. And we've all had this moment where we think, what if I could do something like that? It could be like you want to be a rock star or a famous athlete, like or anything like that. But the second that came up, that excitement came up, this fear popped up and said, you can't do that. That's not you. You're an alcoholic. You smoke a pack of cigarettes a day. You're unhealthy. Why would you think you're an Ironman? Are you joking? That's crazy. And then, of course, the shame spiral started, and I just didn't think about it again for another decade or so. But that seed was planted so that when I had that sobriety, when I went through that process of getting sober, and it was not an easy process. I mean, the reason I got sober was because I just reached a low point of absolute hopelessness and despair, where I knew that I was a danger to other people and not just myself. But it was a year of sobriety where I got sober. I did the work. It was my first experience really since high school of doing anything that I was disciplined at. But it created a point of reference for me that I could achieve things that I once thought were impossible. And so throughout that first year of sobriety, I'd always heard from the elders in Alcoholics Anonymous that I shouldn't make any major life changes my first year in recovery. And so I took that to heart. I'm like, okay, not going to make any major life changes, no career changes, no moving to new geography, anything like that. But that also imprinted in my head that maybe at a year of sobriety, I should make a major life change. And so that's when I had a year of sobriety, I was laying in bed, recovering from a shoulder surgery and trying to figure out like, what major life change do I want to make? And as I was consuming vast amounts of peanut M&Ms and pizza, I realized that maybe my physical health was the thing I should probably make the change on.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where it just prompted that memory to pop up of, I just remembered, it was like kind of this divinely inspired memory of the Ironman triathlon. And it was just this epiphany of like, in movies where they have that epiphany moment and everything just flashes at once in front of the screen.
Yeah.
It's kind of what happened in my mind. And I realized, well, I want to do that Ironman World Championship race. I want to do that race.
Yes.
So I looked online and I tried to figure out how to sign up for it. And I realized you have to qualify. And I'm like, okay, so it's going to be a little harder. So I ended up signing up for an Ironman, and to happen a year later in Cabo San Lucas. So I signed up without having ever done a triathlon in my life, and just decided to figure it out on the way. And that started the journey.
Wow. Okay. So looking back, people are listening. Maybe some of them are like, hey, I want to try that. I've had some friends lately, they've signed up for half marathon, full marathon, different stuff. Where would you advise them looking back at that? What helped you actually prepare and get through all of that? Because I think a lot of people start with good intentions, right? And they don't finish that out. They have that big dream like you had. But I mean, Adam, I would say the percentages are low.
Yeah.
That they actually complete it. What helped you get through it as you look back?
Well, here's the biggest thing that helped me was something that I fell upon kind of by accident. And It was a training method that was developed by Phil Maffetone. And there's a little bit of context to this that I think in our society, we're convinced to believe that in order to be successful in any pursuit, we need to give 110% all the time. Everything we've got. We hear that everywhere. Go big, go home, go no pain, no gain, or stay hard, like the David Goggins stuff. And it's just, and so I was convinced of that all throughout my life. So anytime I tried to do any fitness pursuit, P90X or whatever, I would, go big. And then 4 days later, I would get injured or just burn out. And I think a lot of us fall into that trap. But what I learned by looking into it, and there was a bit of serendipity because I was injured at the time. So I had to go to Google and I had to type in how to train easy for an Ironman. And weirdly, it brought up a lot of great results, Maffetone method being one of them. And what that promotes is that an athlete give about work out at a heart rate that is approximately 80% of an athlete's maximum effort. And so when I saw this, I read up on it. I read the theory that by giving 80% consistently, an athlete could start to build volume and not deplete their energy, but they could grow their capacity and they could continue to improve. And I looked at this and I thought to myself, well, if professional athletes, some of whom are winning world championships, are giving 80% in training, and seeing these incredible results, why are we being conditioned to believe that we need to give 110% all the time? And so I started training diligently with that 80%. And what I found was that at the beginning, it was kind of the opposite of what you feel when you start a fitness routine and you go and you're like really excited and you give everything you've got. You feel good that first day, and then you feel good for a while, but then you burn out. This was the exact opposite. I felt at the beginning like I wasn't doing enough. Like I was like, is that it? I mean, I don't feel like I'm doing enough. But over time, I found that my paces were getting faster as a runner. 15 minutes per mile as I started, to 13 minutes per mile, to 10 minutes per mile, to 8 minutes per mile, all just by staying consistent and disciplined with that 80%. And so it was a big lesson for me. And I think that a lot of people who want to start the process of really anything that's endurance related, whether it be an Ironman or whether it be starting a business or in relationships or your faith or whatever it may be, just focus on 80% so that you can play the long game, not the short and powerful game. Leave that to the David Gogginses of the world. Focus on 80% consistently.
Man, I love that. Yeah. And I'm a huge Goggins fan, and I relate this to people all the time is, the reality is what he's been through and what his capacity has been built to is not yours. Right. And the lifestyle that he lives is different. So you do want to model that. And I love that you shared that, because years ago when I was in a season that I was waking up extremely early, going to the early workouts, and I really needed that breakthrough, is I remember a coach of mine was like, Brian, don't try to wake up an hour earlier.
Yeah.
Start going in like 10-minute increments, man. And like over a month, over 2 months, you go from, let's say it's 6 a.m. and you're at 5:50, 5:40, 5:30, and goes, your body's not going to realize that over time. I think too many of us, right? Like we want to just take it all down and like, I'm going to train for a marathon. I'm going to get it done in a week and I'm going to go run it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what's going to happen? I love you said the injury piece too, because as an athlete myself, and I think we don't think about that as entrepreneurs, is if we get injured, and it may not be us injured, I think about, are the relationships getting injured because I go 110% into my business and I forget I have a family over here.
Yeah.
I forget that I have my health and I'm sacrificing all those things. And I've been in those seasons. And so I'd love for you to talk about that. Look, you've done a lot of these things, but you're also somebody, I don't want people to miss this, is like you have a family, you have a business, a family business, it's 100 years old. And like you have all these other responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
What's your approach to that when you're in something like that that's demanding you in so many areas? How do you stay focused and how do you take care of all those areas?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something that I think is a constant pursuit. It's not something I think that we're ever solving, because I think as people who want to achieve things, it's natural, especially as you start to grow your responsibilities, that just more things come in. So it becomes less of a let me find things that I want to pursue, and less of and more of, well, let me make sure that I'm saying no to the things that aren't, serving the bigger goal. like, you know, making sure that I'm not pursuing more things than I need to, because what you get into that moment of like, your eyes are bigger than your stomach and you want to just pursue a bunch of things, but you have to, you just have to focus intently on that prioritization on what is the priority. And the priorities for me right now, as it stands for the next 5 years, are faith, you know, family, and making sure that I'm building, you know, or trying to expand my creative potential. So those are really the three things that I'm trying to build on right now. And the author of Good to Great is escaping me right now. I don't know why. I've read that book so many times. Yeah, thank you, Jim Collins. Yes. He says in his book that if you have any more than 3 priorities, you have no priorities. Yes. So I try to model that kind of stuff, and I try to look at that stuff on a quarterly basis by doing a vision reflection retreat. I get away by myself for just 2 days, and that first day, I do a reflection on the previous quarter, where I look at like what I achieved, what the wins were I consistent with those 3 priorities, where did I grow, where do I need help? And then the next day I do a vision part. I look at my long-term vision and I break it down into quarterly goals and what do I want to achieve? And I try to align those with the 3 priorities that I have. And that way I kind of stay consistent with that. And it gives me a framework for what I can say no to and what I can say yes to. And because it is easy to get caught in that trap of like, well, I need to work more, you know, and then it falls into this trap of, well, I need to support my family, so I'm justifying it. And now it comes into more fear, because now I'm afraid that if I don't work, I'm not going to make the money to support my family, and you just become a workaholic, and that replaces the alcohol or whatever the other stuff was that you were using. So that's kind of where it is, and that's a continuous process of discipline that's required on that. And I'm by no means perfect at it.
Me either. But I love how you broke down your process, right? Because I think people can look at that and go, okay, quarterly, I've got 3 priorities and I'm reflecting on those. I'm looking back and adjusting. And it is a process. And I found different seasons require different things from us. And although those priorities may stay where they are, underneath those might require a little bit different actions and what the disciplines are there. And so I love that you said that. And you've said this a few times, and I know this is something you speak on quite a bit, and fear being our biggest obstacle that most of us deal with. And I can be the first to admit and attest, even through my sports days, like fear would rear its ugly head, and you're like, oh man. And even in life, like today, the reality is fear creeps back in. It almost like it has this way of coming back into us. So talk to me about that and why you believe that is our biggest obstacle that many of us face today.
Yeah, I think that it's a big obstacle for us, because if you think back on times when you were fearful, there's really 2 reasons we feel fear right now. One is because of danger. Like we're in danger. We're at the edge of a cliff. We're looking 2,000 feet into the abyss below us, and fear is telling us, hey, you're in danger. Maybe you should step away from the cliff. And that, evolutionarily speaking, is a very important reason fear exists. I mean, and up until about maybe 150 years ago, it was one of the primary reasons fear existed. But more recently than that, in the comfort of our first world that we live in today, we've started to experience fear more often for a different reason. And I think we experience it more often because of this than we do because of danger. And that is because we are approaching the edge of our comfort zone on something. We're pushing to the edge of what's comfortable for us. And that fear is telling us, maybe evolutionarily speaking, that we're in danger. It's just telling us that, but we're not really in danger. We are really just pushing to the edge of our comfort level. And for that reason, I think it's an opportunity to maybe push a little bit beyond it, see what's on the other side of it. So even though we have that feeling like we're in danger, once we recognize we're not in danger, we can actually take that feeling, maybe step back from it and say, okay, well, I'm feeling this, but what is it telling me? What is it really telling me? And I think that there's really 3 root causes to fear, to non-danger fear. And those 3 root causes are uncertainty. We're uncertain about the future. We just don't know what to expect. We have a fear of missing out, or a fear of failing, or being rejected. And the second one is overwhelm. We just have too much stimulus coming in, too much on our plate, so we just can't get to it all. And the last one is the big one, self-doubt, that feeling like we're not enough, like we don't have what it takes to achieve the next level. And so one of those three reasons is usually the root cause of why we're feeling that fear. So if we could see that, we can start to rise above it and say, okay, well, what if it's telling me that? How do I approach that? And I think that's where things like approaching things at 80% capacity are a good thing, because then you avoid the overwhelm. Or you step back, and instead of doing a giant swan dive past your comfort zone or thinking that you need to go out and run that marathon tomorrow, you start approaching it with a 5% approach, where you just try to expand your comfort zone by 5% at a time, and stacking those 5% until the very next 5% is the dream or the goal that you're working on, the marathon that you're getting to. And so those are some of the approaches I think that you can take when you run into one of those three root causes. But the first one is just to name it. And that sets a foundation for how you can ultimately rise above it.
I love that. And I love, we're very much aligned on this, because I've looked back in my own life and where fear has presented itself, and I've tried just to go so far all in and just like take it down right away.
Yeah.
It's usually left me either beat down, not successful. The success was fleeting. It lasted a little bit, but it went away. It wasn't consistent. So everybody listening, I want you guys to grab that, is you got somebody that's an Ironman that's overcome, addiction and all of these things, and breaking down a process. And I think that's where a lot of, especially entrepreneurs, we struggle with having a process. And one of my coaches always says this, Brian, is like, we're just stacking wins every day.
Yeah.
Tomorrow's going to be tomorrow, but today, what are the wins you can stack? Make that difficult call. Who's somebody you need to follow up with? Who's somebody you need to check in on, right? And you're just doing these basic, what we think are basic, but you look up at the end of the day and you're like, man, I got like 5 wins.
Yeah.
Okay. You stack that over 5 days, 5 months, 5 years, and you start to really project this out. And I love that you really call it something, because I found that too, like as an athlete, even as a business owner today, a lot of times we just come up with these crazy things because we're so creative, which can also be a detriment, because we create these scenarios that never actually happen as they go through. And so if somebody's listening out there, and this is one that's come up a lot today, is we've got people changing companies, changing jobs and all that. If somebody's looking at potentially a career change or a company change and all that, is there a way that you approach that fear so that they can make the best decision and most informed decision for them? And I always say, I don't use the word right decision, because I think it's just the best decision, right? Like you can look back on it in 5 years and maybe determine, was it right or wrong? I don't know.
Yeah.
It was the best.
Right. Yeah. And that's, that I think that's a process for everybody. I mean, and depending on your faith, one of the ways to do that is to, whether you pray or whether anything like that, is certainly pray about it to whatever your higher power might be. And I think another way, if that's a little bit beyond, I just think finding that quiet time to enter the space of letting the right ideas come in. Because a lot of times we're trying to force the ideas in our brain. It's a rat's nest of things just running through our minds. And if that's happening, one of the best approaches that I've found to actually stop that process is to just write it all down. Do a brain dump, like just write out everything that's happening in your brain. As ridiculous as it sounds, it could be like you could be writing about a UFO that's landing in Mississippi right now, and it's just because it's in your mind. But the important thing about that is it's getting it out of your head onto a piece of paper, and it's starting that creative process. It's starting to kind of create a flow. And when your brain is thinking in that way, it unlocks different ways for you to kind of think through what the right approach would be. And if I could relate it to how I decided to pursue the Ironman triathlon, there was something distinct about that I was drawn to, and it happened because I was feeling that excitement about that thing that I wanted to pursue. Like it was like this excitement moment, but I also mentioned that fear popping up in equal measure. And I think that when excitement and fear pop up in you in equal measure, I think that's a moment. I call it an oh crap moment, because it's like, oh my, that's like the instinctive, like, oh my gosh, it's like, yeah. And so I think that's something to look for too, that you might be onto something that you want to pursue, if it's a career change or something like that. And, just that there's so much power in that moment to explore it, but there's also so much power in just writing down like what the benefits are, and really speaking to your cohort, your mastermind, or whomever it might be, the people that have been where you want to be, to decide if that's the right direction for you.
I love that. Yeah. And I'm a big, you got to pray about it, right? Like, and God will open doors and close things and give you that wisdom as you go through it. And so I've often found through those decisions, I mean, that is the number one place to start. And it helps you gain that clarity. And I love that you mentioned writing down. I only started that a few years ago, and, stressed about certain things and all that. I remember my coach was like, can you just write all that stuff down and like send me it? And I was like, what? And I remember the feeling literally after I wrote it down and sent it to him, I was like, I'm good. And the next call, he's like, hey, let's talk about this stuff. How are you feeling? And I was like, I'm good. He goes, that was the exercise. And I was like, man, and to have that though, guys, this is free coaching basically, to give you what some of us like Adam and I'm sure have invested to learn these things. You can apply them in your own life today. And in this season, I think that's there. And I'd love for you to talk about this as you've got your book, Shifting Gears. My first thought, I'm like, of course, triathlete and all that, shifting gears in a car, shifting gears in a bike and all of this stuff. I'm like, how many times in my own life have I had to shift gears?
Yes.
And wow, knowing what gear to be in each part of the day and all that. So let's talk to people a little bit about the book so they know kind of the genesis of that, who it's for and who you were thinking as the audience, and a little insight into it. And we'll pop a link in here, guys, at the end so you have access to it.
Yeah. So I wrote the book a few years ago, released the audiobook about a year and a half ago. So if you want to hear my droning voice narrate my book, you can hear that for sure. But I wrote it about my story from anxiety and addiction to a triathlon world championship, and just kind of broke down how I got there. And I really wanted to write this for the person who still may be struggling with that idea, who has this dream in their heart, something that they want to pursue, something that God is calling them to do, or that they're just feeling like that's the thing, but there is this obstacle that they feel is in front of them, this brick wall of fear, or anxiety, or whatever it may be. And I wanted to show that person that it is possible, and that there is just such an amazing and miraculous life beyond that feeling of torment that really we're putting upon ourselves because we're fighting against fear. And that's really part of the problem, is we're experiencing this fear. We don't want to feel it. And so we fight against it, and it gets bigger, and we fight against it. It gets bigger. Instead of acknowledging it, turning around, facing it. And facing it does not mean fighting it. Facing it means acknowledging it, seeing it as something that's real, and then saying, what are you asking me to do? And then really embracing it to rise above it and move to the next level. And that's really what the book is about. It talks about my entire journey from childhood, anxiety, alcoholism, to crossing the finish line at the Ironman World Championship. Spoiler alert, that's the end of the story. So
I saw the memoir and that there, and I love that you shared that. I want to make sure to put a plug, because if you've listened to Adam's story today, the book is really going to complement everything we talked about, but in a deeper level, so you can actually go through the journey and the story. And a lot of us can find our own story within other people and go, man, that's me, or that was me. Maybe you have kids that they're going through some of that today, and all of that. Somebody you love and care about, it's in your family, and you're like, that could be a gift for them. And we've seen that enough. I know in my own life of people that have struggled with whether it's alcohol or drugs or substance abuse. So you go, I wish there was a way to help them, and if they can relate to that, I think that's super cool.
Yeah.
Well, shifting gears to speaking, because you're speaking on stages. You talk about fear and a lot of that stuff. I'd love for you to talk about, we've got people that want to speak on stages. And so kind of a different angle to this is what really made you want to speak on stages? And then for those aspiring to share their story, what have you learned as you've now spoken on, hundreds of stages?
Yeah. So I've always loved performing. I grew up playing cello and things like that, a lot of music and stuff. So it's always been something I've enjoyed. And so I think that the things that we should, that a lot of times that can fill us up, that we pursue, are at the crossroads of the things that we're talented at, the things that we enjoy, and the things that, I think that we're called to do with regard to a message. And I believe that I have a message that I am very passionate about sharing, that people can rise above this hopelessness, but also that they can even for people that don't feel hopeless, just people that are feeling like that sense of fear, or feeling stuck, or feeling like they're like they just can't get to the next level. I want to help them to change that relationship with those limiting beliefs, those limiting fears, the psychological obstacles that they have, to say that, hey, this is not necessarily the obstacle, and you can remove it. When you remove it, you actually find greater flow. And once you rise above it. And so that's what I speak on. And I'm very passionate about that. And for people that are looking to share their message on stage, I think some of the things that I've learned are that, it's definitely not as simple as just feeling like, I've got a talent for speaking, and so I'm just going to share it on stage. I mean, there's a lot more to it. Keeping an audience for an hour, keeping entertainment, keeping that attention and all that stuff. And this, I mean, doing a podcast, it's the same way. It's like, how do you get that attention and keep it? That's probably one of the harder things. But it is a very rewarding kind of career, because, you do get to connect with a lot of people. And I've found in my life that there's things that feel light and there's things that feel heavier. And, I've explored ways in which, should I go one-on-one kind of coaching, or should I go one-on, or one-to-many, and I feel like the best way that I can connect with people is one-to-many. And I just enjoy talking to crowds, and it fills me up, and I feel lighter when I do it.
Yeah, I love that. And I see that a lot lately, and people are wanting to share their stories, and some of them are very powerful stories. And I love that you said this too. I don't want people to miss this, is just because you think you're a good communicator or you enjoy doing that, to make sure you're doing it for those right reasons. And that impact, I love you said, that one to many for you allows you to impact people, and you never know that opportunity. And I hired a coach several years ago, Adam, because I knew I had a story. I knew I could communicate well in the business setting and like corporate environments and all that. I'm like, but I don't have how do I connect and all this stuff? And we had to strip away layers and layers and layers. And I share all that with you guys listening in today, because that might be a process that you need to go through, really, to connect with people, at their heart, and then get their head to buy into, okay, now what's that mean for me? What's the action I can take from there? And you many times see a speaker, and a lot of the ones we admire, and you don't know the thousands, hundreds of thousands of reps they've put in. And so if you're aspiring to do that, follow what Adam's doing, watch people that are doing this professionally, and not only have the passion for it, but also just think they put in the hours and the reps, because that'll guide you. That'll help you as you go through. You've mentioned this a couple times today, and I love this word flow. And I was introduced to flow as an athlete, but I would love to know how you define flow, and what does that look like for you and others that are listening? They're like, what is flow?
Yeah. So I love Stephen Kotler's definition of flow. And he wrote the book, The Art of Impossible, and Nar Country, a lot of really, really great books by Stephen Kotler. And he's the executive director of the Flow Research Collective. So he knows a thing or two about flow. And he says that it is an elevated state of consciousness where you are performing at your best and you feel your best. So you're performing your best, you feel your best. And so when I think about that definition, I also think about how I feel when I am feeling in fear, like when I'm in it and I feel like I am afraid, and I feel like I'm not at my best. I feel like I'm too worried. I'm actually limiting myself. And I feel like I'm just in this lower state of consciousness at that point. So that's why I think about flow as being the opposite of fear. The opposite of fear is not fearlessness, because you think of somebody who's fearless, a drunk guy at a frat party standing on a roof that's going to jump into a pool. That's fearlessness. Yeah. It's also the scariest thing in the world. The idea of fearlessness is frightening. But I do think that if you rise above fear, you achieve flow, because you're no longer living in the fear, though you still may feel the feelings of them. You can rise above them and experience this flow state. And flow state for me is something that you can achieve on a relative frequency, but not constantly. Because just like anything else, just like exercise, if you're going to go out and run, for a period of time, you have to stop, you have to rest, you have to recover in order to get back into it. So knowing the flow of flow for, that is also just an important thing to get into. And so knowing that there's stages of flow and how to get into it, that's important. But I think just on a very high level, if people can understand that getting into flow is just that elevated state of consciousness, that feeling like you're above yourself, like you're out of body and performing at your very best, even beyond what you think are your capabilities. And that's possible for anybody if you can employ these steps of rising above fear.
I love that. And for those of you, if flow is new to you, you gave a great book there with Stephen's book. And then you've got some things that you've shared. You've got your podcast that you talk about. I love that. I wrote that down about, flow over fear. This is something I would highly encourage you, even challenge you to study, because as I went back, I was introduced to this in sports, and I didn't realize there were other areas in my life that I started to recognize, wow, that's when I'm in my flow state. When you start to recognize it, I do think a lot of people are in search of this meaning and passion and, your why and all these things that, different ways of saying it. And you've said that several times, of pursuit. And I often found when we're pursuing something we're truly passionate about and we're in a flow state, those are also signs that God gives you of like, hey, I've given you these gifts.
Yeah.
When you're using them, that's why you feel like it's not even effort or work or things that you would want to stop. And your point, you're like, man, I wish I could stay in that state, but it doesn't last forever. The more you study this, guys, this is what the high performers learn, their flow state, and then they're able to replicate it. And I've started to study this, as I've looked at it, Adam, like, okay, when is this happening? Jot it down. Okay, why was that happening? Are there other areas what can I learn the patterns from that? And I'm still a student of this because I think it's something that we just learn over time. And what I'm doing now in my mid 40s is different than what I did in my 20s and 30s. And so I think if you that are listening, look at this, because a lot of times I find people are searching for this thing when it's maybe right in front of them. If they were to write it down and what's there, what's some of the things for you? Because where do you find your best flow state, and what does that look like today for Adam?
Yeah, so I'm really playing with this idea that flow is really this state that you have to treat like exercise or like an exercise program. That and this is also evidence that comes from Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who studied flow early on. I'm probably butchered his name, I always do. But Stephen Kotler has looked at the same thing, and other flow researchers, that there's really these four states of flow. There's this struggle phase, and this part's important because the very first stage of that flow is struggle. You're fighting. It's like, you start to push the car when your car is broken down, and you're not immediately like getting that traction and moving on. You have to struggle first to get there. And then and that could be applied to any kind of thing that you're doing on a daily basis, whether you're just doing a daily activity or for a longer term practice. There's a struggle phase of trying to get into it. And then you get into this initial kind of progress phase where you are starting to where you actually you continue to struggle with it. And I'm sorry, actually the second stage, you step away from it and you take some time to just put the thing down for a while and then think about it, let it process. This is something of a rest kind of phase. And then when you come back to it, then you start to make this progress where you start to get into that flow state. But remembering that flow is not permanent, you have to be really intentional about when to cut it off. Like, because once that flow state ends, once you come out of it, once you come back from that elevated state of consciousness, it's not a gradual decline. It's a fall off a cliff and you're done. And if you keep trying to push it, you're pushing yourself beyond the edge of burnout. So it's an important thing. You just have to shut off the spigot when you are really when you're still at that peak, so that you can come back to it the next day or in the next moment, or when you have that rest to really come back to it. And I think one of the things that's a bit counterintuitive about flow, because we want to think of flow as something that is always happening, that we can always get into and never get out of. I think the important thing to note about flow is most of the work happens when we're not in it, when we're resting, when you rest, when you're at your best, and then you can actually make those adaptations and make the connections in your mind, so that when you come back to it, you get back into that flow state more easily, and then you do the work and you rest again. So, more of the time in rest than you are in flow. That's the important element of being in flow.
I love that. It's almost back to the 80% you talked about, where so many people want to just push past, but really finding out where that is for you. And as your capacity increases, like, you can start to do more things as you go. So And this has been an incredible conversation, and I want to make sure people know where to find you. So we've got a couple things on your Flow Over Fear podcast. That's on Apple and everywhere. So guys, check it out. We'll put a link there. And then you've got your book, Shifting Gears. So we'll make sure people can grab that on Amazon, right? Go to your website. I saw a link for it there. Make sure you grab the book. And where else should they connect with you to follow along with your journey and to learn more about what you're up to?
Yeah, so my website is adamcliffordhill.com if you're kind of old school and like to go to websites. But if you're on social media, you can find me on Instagram where beware, you'll just see a bunch of dad jokes on there every day. But yeah, you can find me there at theadamchill.com or not .com, I'm sorry, at theadamchill for Instagram. Yep. And yeah, on LinkedIn, I'm just Adam C. Hill. So you can find me on any of those platforms.
Cool. Put you there. And I saved this for the end and intentionally, but you brought it up there. What's your go-to, your best dad joke that if somebody were to say, hey, because I know you love this. I've seen your YouTube channel and I'm like, man, you've got some good sense of humor. What's the go-to dad joke that somebody can take in the holidays and use?
Oh man, you're putting me on the spot. I think let's see, what did I post today? Let's see. Well, I think I was starting to do a dad joke about trees this morning, but I decided to branch out instead.
Oh, I love it.
That's the kind of awkwardness you want to get from those kinds of things, right? Too.
Well, you know what? For all the dads out there listening to this, and for people, like I always think when somebody puts you on the spot for one of those, and was like, "Oh, whoa, hold on, let me try to get that in." We're giving you a gift, guys. You can go use that at your next party. Business or family. Follow Adam for more of those. And Adam, thank you, man. Your story is inspiring. And I love just seeing how from even the depths of where you were to all the way to doing what I say is like the biggest physical fitness test I think that exists out there. And for somebody to go that extreme and to be able to do that and to stick with what you've done, your faith, talking about your family and what you're doing. And I just appreciate you and how you show up. You're making the world a better place. This has been a great conversation. We're going to link below. And I just want to say from me, our community, and everybody, thank you for how you show up and deliver.
Thank you, Brian. This was an honor. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Guys, it's been an amazing episode. Make sure you follow Adam. We're going to put the links in there. And as always, make sure you you subscribe on YouTube, all that fun stuff. Leave us a review. Let us know. I know Adam's like me. We want to know that we made an impact. If something stood out to you today, it resonated with you, share it with your friends. Share it with people that need to hear this. Let us know how we've impacted you, how we can serve you better. Till then, guys, we'll catch you on the next episode. Make sure you go out there and do something great.